TAG Heuer is a brand today that gets a bad rap in our enthusiast circles, primarily to do with its history, its shaky development when it first acquired Heuer and became a conglomerate. But I guarantee you that 80% of those of you who are watching this video probably got into watches because of TAG Heuer. It's an extremely prominent brand in our lives, me included. The Jack Heuer 80th birthday Carrera was the first watch that made me stop in my tracks and actually look at watches. And this was before I was even into watches. It's amazing to think this was probably 10 years ago at least. But today, with an example like the Carrera Glassbox that made us all stop in our tracks and ironically became one of the best watches of the show at Watches and Wonders, being one of the standouts, and for the first time in a long time that I've read from a handful of testimonials, people are looking at TAG Heuer for TAG Heuer, not for the simple one line of print on the dial, but rather seeing these two brands together. And I wanted to make this video to try and understand why, looking at this gorgeous new edition and everything that they've done right with the model. Design inspirations, as well as modern innovations. So let's get into it. The Heuer Carrera. I've wanted to make a video about this watch, its history, for over 2 years, but never found a great segue to talk about it, and I think now is the perfect opportunity, especially because of what this glass box reference represents. The Carrera and Heuer's backstory in the 1960s, it's inspired. How Jack Heuer was able to put his name on virtually all racing properties at the time, and how that simple, bright red font defined sports chronographs for decades. I have to insert one of Hodinkee's latest videos, their most recent reference points conversation where they run through the entire Heuer Carrera history. It is fascinating, criminally underrated, and I think it deserves at least 3 times the number of views that it currently has. I'm sure I'll be referencing a lot of the footage of these watches in the video. But the development of the Carrera, this glacial improvement and change and modification to create one of the most simple, minimalist, but legible sports chronographs of the age. These 1960s machines are seen as icons today, not only because they were the hot topic and worn by everybody, but because of how well executed their designs were. And it's great to think that at the time these watches were competing with the likes of the Daytona and the Breitling Navitimer, but the Heuer Carrera was the it watch. Now, I won't take the time of this video to talk about the origins of the Carrera history, but I think it's well worth watching the reference points video for all of that knowledge. But really, it was one of those perfect occasions when a watch of this caliber was required and needed, and Jack Heuer met the brief. But what's even more fascinating for someone like me who loves the development and the evolution of design is to see where these watches went and where the designs took them. And as they changed to the slightly later models, we started seeing the Panda and reverse Panda dials. This style and formula was created to aid in chronograph legibility, to give the subdials more emphasis. And when you think of watches that championed the reverse Panda dial at the time, Rolex Daytona 6263 Big Red, Breitling Navitimer 806, the Heuer Carrera, truly the innovators of this time. But when we think of the other two brands and where they were looking, one wasn't really sure what it was, the other was aimed at pilots. The Carrera was always aimed at being the driver's watch, and we could call it the ultimate driver's watch. Now, we have seen how TAG Heuer has adjusted the image of this brand, how they have given us reissues, and how they've tried their best to remove TAG off their dials in favor of creating watches that are more one-to-one relevant next to the pieces in their past catalog. Some of these modern examples have been a massive success, like the Otavia, like the Caliber 11 Monaco, like many of the reissue Carreras, celebrating anniversaries, celebrating certain milestones. Another great example is the Monza, one of my favorites. But through these ever-ongoing processes of creating these reissues, the brand tends to hide TAG from the dials. And that's mainly because these watches are aimed at collectors and us as enthusiasts. We don't necessarily want to see TAG Heuer on a dial that's paying tribute to the past. But what I love about this hobby of ours is that when something is done right in the watch space, irrespective of the brand, it gets attention, it gets press coverage, and a lot of us take a good look at them. And I'll put it out there, I believe that TAG Heuer smashed it this year with the glass box. Specifically the reverse Panda dial, which I'm going to be talking about the most. The blue one doesn't really talk to me very much. In a way, I kind of liked the tongue-in-cheek Ryan Gosling advert with him not wanting to give the prop watch back and all of that stuff. The Carrera being on display, the presentation was very nice. But the more I look at this reverse Panda model, the more I see that past inspiration paired with a great new development with that industrial design, three-dimensionality. with many vintage cues that I think a lot of us will appreciate. And I think what I like most about this watch, which might be a contentious subject, I actually like the use of TAG Heuer on its dial, because it very much speaks to the identity of this watch, where it comes from and where it sits now. Like I've said in a few videos before, I like it when a brand manages to look at its heritage, its history, but also understand the direction that it's going as a modern property. How this design has managed to couple these developments together is the reason why it's getting its own video. The two references that you need to know: where this watch found its inspiration. The reference 2447NS. It was a reverse panda dial from the 1960s, a manual wind. Elegant, sophisticated, extremely refined. And the next reference, which is a severe oddball, the first time that Heuer ever introduced a date complication in their chronograph, commonly known today as the Dato 12, the reference 3147N. This piece only lasted for a year because it was so unpopular, no one understood its purpose, why it was there. Of course, the big downside is having a chronograph hand in the middle of the dial. You can't read the date, but it still looks beautiful because of its symmetry. Regardless, that's where the inspiration came from. Seeing these two references melded together is very appealing to the eye. Maybe it's just me who feels this way. And the joke is, if it wasn't for the added date complication at the 12, I don't think I would be looking at it twice. Just injects that little bit of quirkiness, that bit of humor, a good callback to the past to make it far more interesting. And in keeping with that classic nuance, you see Swiss printed inside the 6 o'clock subdial. The typefaces all look period correct for that 60s chronograph. And then to tie it up nicely, instead of looking like a typical reissue, TAG steps in with the whole idea of this three-dimensional tachymeter scale that blends into the minute track. This is where I believe the name Glassbox comes from. What I've learned over the years is that these sort of details matter. For the vintage enthusiast who would notice this, first impressions, but to those who may be new to the hobby, to those of us who really want an efficient looking chronograph, you start picking up on these small signs that I don't think many other brands have managed to address as well. But other things like a sapphire caseback, the fact that the watch measures something like 13 millimeters in thickness, including the boxed crystal. How the case is 39 millimeters in diameter, which I think is a perfect size for a watch like this, with a lug-to-lug of 46, 47 millimeters. Now yes, you could say I'm looking at this as an enthusiast, but I think as a designer, looking at every little niche that's been addressed, the team responsible for this watch knew exactly what they were doing, and I think they had so much fun putting this together. Not only because the technology of today allows for these kinds of changes, but also because there is such a strong link and a strong foundation from where this watch came from. And instead of just looking like a faithful one-to-one homage or reissue, this feels like the next step. Time and time again, it shows that you don't need to reinvent the wheel to create an excellent new property. All that really matters is that you approach it with care and with understanding. So as a modern property that's pulling back the pages and giving a strong nod to where it originated, this is masterful. And I reckon it's a piece that deserves to be appreciated by all of us enthusiasts. Maybe I should share a quick disclaimer. This is not a paid review. TAG Heuer has not reached out and asked me to make a review about this watch. I genuinely feel this way about the property. I think it looks exceptional. I've been on quite a chronograph trip lately, and this one just arrived at the perfect time. It's very much a designer's dream when you're given an opportunity like this amount of creative freedom where you're not pressured to follow a formula, but rather implement new approaches. So in closing, this is one of the best reverse panda dial chronographs I have seen in a long time. That's not a reissue, and that's saying something. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one.